Way back in the 1980s, I remember reading small footnotes in a number of histories about the Third Reich concerning a Dr. SS Karl Vaernet, who experimented on gay prisoners in Buchenwald and Neuengamme concentration camps. I was surprised that this was merely a footnote, and did further research and found that no one seemed to know really anything about him or what happened to him after the war. So beginning in the late 1980s, I began to try and research who was this doctor, what did he actually do, and indeed, after 1945, where did he end up? It was very difficult. There was no great enthusiasm by anyone to research what he did or his subsequent fate. When I contacted the German government and the Nazi archives, they were not interested or claimed they didn't know anything. When prompted, they expressed no great desire or interest in pursuing matters. So this sort of was a bit of a red rag to me. I thought, well, someone needs to do it. I was very conscious that I am not an historian, and my intellectual and academic capacities are considerably limited, but nevertheless, I thought I'd have a go. Basically, the story is that Dr. Karl Vaernet's barbaric medical experiments on gay concentration camp prisoners was more or less hidden from history for over 50 years. Unlike most other Nazi doctors, he was never put on trial at Nuremberg. Instead, what I discovered to my great shock was that with British military collusion, he escaped to Argentina, where he lived openly and continued to research his methods for the so-called eradication of homosexuality. The backstory is that Karl Vaernet was a Copenhagen doctor, a Danish citizen, who, realizing the opportunities offered by the homophobic policies of the Nazis, joined the Nazi Party and enlisted in the SS in order to pursue, with Nazi funding, his research to find a cure for the problem of homosexuality, as he saw it. In Buchenwald, his research was conducted on the personal authority of the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. The Gestapo chief had demanded in the 1930s, quote, the extermination of abnormal existence. The homosexual must be entirely eliminated. So the Nazis had a program for the total eradication of homosexuality. Different but analogous to the program for the extermination of Jews and other so-called inferior peoples. Roll forward 50 plus years, a book was published in Denmark in 2004 by a group of journalists that I had contacted in the 1990s, which eventually exposed the full truth about Vaernet's crimes against queer humanity and his escape from justice at the end of World War II, including the failure of Allied governments to prosecute him for war crimes. The book was called Karl Vaernet, Danish SS Doctor in Buchenwald, and was authored by Hans Davidson Nielsen, Niels Holby, Jacob Ruben, and Niels Berger Danielsen. This was the culmination of a 10-year campaign that I had waged, beginning in the late 1990s, to expose Vaernet's wartime activities and the cover-up by successive Danish and Allied governments. The campaign really got underway in 1998, when, having done all these researches beginning in the late 80s and early 90s, which came to nothing because they were just dead ends or brick walls, official indifference, the campaign took off in 1998 when I decided to write to the then Danish Prime Minister, Poul Rasmussen, calling for an inquiry into the Vaernet case on the basis that he was a Danish citizen, a Danish member of the SS, and therefore the Danish government had a responsibility to investigate this instance. I knew that the only way to really get the Danish government to take this seriously was to go to the press. So I sent this letter to the Danish press and to selected Danish LGBTI activists, Hans Thijssen among others. The letter created a huge public outcry, because most people had been totally unaware of Vaernet's war crimes and the high-level measures taken to shield him from prosecution. The Danish government did not reply to my letter for over 1 year, and only after repeated promptings and repeated exposure in the Danish press about their failure to cooperate. So I didn't get a letter until June 1999. In which the Danish Prime Minister passed the buck to the Ministry of Justice. He said this wasn't a matter for the Prime Minister's office, this is a matter for the Minister of Justice. So I contacted the Minister of Justice, and he said, oh no, it's not our responsibility. He said, this is the responsibility of the National Archives of Denmark. To which I responded, I am calling for an investigation of a war criminal. That is not the responsibility of the archives, it is the responsibility of the Ministry of Justice. So, refusing to launch an inquiry into my allegation that Vaernet had committed crimes against humanity and that his escape from justice appeared to have been assisted by prominent Danish citizens, including government ministers and the police chief of Copenhagen, the Ministry of Justice's response was, it is not our responsibility. It said, if you are so concerned about this case as we believe you are, we suggest that you bring a private prosecution or open a criminal investigation yourself. To which I replied, I'm a private citizen, I have no means or resources. This is way beyond my capabilities. This is a legal and moral responsibility of the Danish government. So they responded, yet again, referring me back to the Danish National Archives. When I contacted the archives, I was told that the Vaernet files were classified as top secret and that at the very earliest they could be examined at discretion was 2025. Of course, all this correspondence I was feeding to the Danish press. I was also feeding it to the British press. Not a single newspaper was interested. Not The Guardian, not The Independent, none of the liberal papers who now boast about their support for LGBT rights, none of them gave a fuck. Pardon my language. I also wrote around the same time to the then Argentinian Prime Minister, Carlos Menem, because we'd known that eventually he'd escaped to Argentina. Carl Vaernet had escaped to Argentina. And again, the Argentine government washed their hands of it. It's not our responsibility. Even though he'd lived there openly and been pursuing his investigations and researches into finding a cure for the eradication of homosexuality. The Argentine government said, nothing to do with us. Anyway, the upshot of all this publicity in Denmark, and I've got to thank, there's 2 or 3 Danish LGBT activists and those 4 journalists who wrote the book, who were really the key people. It created huge government embarrassment. There were questions asked in the Danish Parliament, which I fed and others fed to selected Danish MPs. And faced with this mounting public and political pressure, Danish journalists and historians were eventually given access to those previously closed files. But it was not voluntary or willing. It was in the response to huge, massive embarrassment. So based on the archive material, key details of what I call Vaernet's medical Nazism were subsequently revealed in Danish newspapers in late 1999. And these articles are the starting point of the subsequent book. If we can roll back a bit in time, Vaernet was a member of the Danish Nazi Party from the late 1930s. As a doctor, he specialized in hormone research and treatments. In April 1940, when Denmark was occupied by the Nazis, during the subsequent years, fewer and fewer patients visited his clinics because of his known Nazi sympathies. So he was basically ostracized and shunned. But he did pursue his research and became an obsessive researcher into the causes and potential cures of homosexuality. And he saw hormone treatment as the key way forward. So as a result of his declining patients and the general business downturn during the war, by 1943, Carl Vaernet realized that he could not earn enough money in Denmark to carry on his hormone research, which included now potential cures for homosexuality. This led him to approach the Nazis, who he knew were hateful of gay people, and they had a clear desire and program to eradicate homosexuality. What they called to, quote, eliminate the perverted world of the homosexual. So what Vaernet did, he arranged a meeting with, I think it was must have been about 1942, 43. He arranged a meeting with the chief Nazi doctor, Reichsarzt SS Ernst Grawitz, who proposed that Vaernet should continue his research into treatments for homosexuality on behalf of the SS. So he was given official authorization by the Nazis to pursue his work with funding and support from the SS. In November 1943, Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler gave his personal official approval to Vaernet's research project. A month later, a contract was signed and Vaernet was given the rank of SS Sturmbannführer. Vaernet went on to visit Buchenwald concentration camp at least 6 times between June and December 1944. To test his hormone cures, he operated on 17 male inmates in Buchenwald. These were men who were forced to undergo an operation that involved the insertion of an artificial hormonal gland. And 2 of these patients subsequently died from infections caused by the insanitary conditions in Buchenwald. In fact, none of the implants worked. But nevertheless, Vaernet did produce a report to Heinrich Himmler on the 10th of February 1945 describing his hormone research and alleged results. He didn't even mention the experiments took place in Buchenwald. He just mentioned his research. He gave the impression it was going well, that it was progressing. He didn't mention what he'd done in Buchenwald and the failures, which suggests that even he realized that these were a failure. They didn't work. Not sufficiently credible to get a mention. When Denmark was liberated on the 5th of May 1945, Vaernet was arrested and detained at the LGBT Skole POW camp in Copenhagen, where he remained from June to November 1945. The camp was Denmark's main holding centre for war criminals and Nazi collaborators. It was run jointly by the British military mission in Denmark and by the Danish intelligence service under the jurisdiction of the Danish police. The leading officer at LGBT Skole POW camp was a British major, Ronald F. Hemingway. In September 1945, Major Hemingway is recorded as stating that, quote, Vaernet will undoubtedly be sentenced as a war criminal. Despite this official view, during his imprisonment, Vaernet succeeded in convincing the British military authorities, as well as the Danish police, that his hormone therapies were morally justified and could be an international success. He subsequently received special privileged treatment in the POW camp. Unlike other prisoners, he was allowed to communicate with the outside world, and he used this privilege to correspond with business people who were working to market his hormone treatments, including his therapies to, quote, cure homosexuality. During his detention, Vaernet filed 3 Danish patents, 1 American patent, and possibly, it's unclear, a British patent as well. He also appeared to have gained promising contacts with the British-American pharmaceutical company Park, Davis and Comp Limited, based in London and Detroit, and with the American chemical giant DuPont. In 1945, in response to Vaernet's claim that he was suffering from a serious heart condition that required urgent treatment, Major Hemingway astonishingly authorized his transfer, unsupervised, to a Copenhagen hospital. Even more bizarrely, in February 1946, this wanted war criminal was discharged from hospital and allowed to go to his brother's farm in the countryside to convalesce. The consultant doctor of the hospital, Tatchell, had written to the authorities that Vaernet suffered from a critical chronic heart condition for which there was no cure. Berging estimated that Vaernet would probably only live 1 or 2 more years, and, quote, maybe not even that long. Subsequent evidence unearthed reveals a very different story. All Vaernet's heart tests were entirely normal. He received no treatment at all during his 3 months in hospital. He merely stayed there, effectively as a guest of his colleague and probable Nazi sympathizer, Dr. Berging. This suggests that his heart condition was faked as a way of getting him out of the POW camp. After Vaernet was discharged from hospital in February 1946, prominent Danish citizens made further attempts to convince the authorities of the seriousness of Vaernet's illness, apparently in a bid to get the war crime charges dropped. In August 1946, one of them wrote to the Danish public prosecutor that Vaernet's health had deteriorated so badly that he was almost crippled. A vitamin E treatment by a respected professor at a Swedish hospital in Stockholm, Anders V. Christensen, was allegedly the only hope for him. On the basis of a medical certificate supplied by one of Vaernet's high-placed friends, the Danish public prosecutor gave Vaernet a travel permit to go to Sweden for treatment. And Vaernet was even paid a small state stipend to support him during his stay there. A man up for war crimes charges gets a permit to travel abroad and gets state funding to support himself. But letters subsequently discovered, written by Vaernet during this period between February and August 1946, make not a jot of mention about his declining health. Instead, they refer to, quote, "everything is ready in Argentina," and, quote, "the money is ready in Sweden." During his brief stay in Sweden, Vaernet is thought to have changed his name and assumed a new identity. He probably got his costs paid by the extensive Nazi escape Denmark that operated in Denmark and Sweden during the post-war years, a network that often operated with the connivance of the Catholic Church. During November 1946, Danish police contacted the Swedish doctor, Professor Christensen, who was supposed to be treating Vaernet with his vitamin E cure. Christensen told them he had never even heard of Vaernet. The last trace of Vaernet in Europe is in December 1946, when he visited a Dutch doctor in Amsterdam. Soon afterwards, it's thought that he boarded a transatlantic passenger ship headed for South America. In January 1947, the police chief in Frederiksberg, a district of Copenhagen, was informed that, quote, "Vaernet has arrived in Brazil." The police chief did nothing, although Vaernet was on the wanted list of Nazi war criminals. Vaernet was later subsequently identified in 1947 as having settled in the Argentine capital, Buenos Aires, living there under his own name, Karl Vaernet. He subsequently resumed his hormone research with funding from the Argentine Ministry of Health, which is also very interested in the eradication of homosexuality. During the spring of 1947, US Brigadier Telford Taylor, who was the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, wrote to the Danish Medical Association with new information about Vaernet's wartime activities. Now, this new evidence came to light, and that was presented to the Danish Medical Association. A little later, in the summer of 1947, Danish newspapers began reporting details about Vaernet's medical experiments at Buchenwald. This put a lot of pressure on the Danish authorities to seek Vaernet's extradition from Argentina. But in February 1949, the then Danish Minister of Justice, Niels Busch Jensen, concluded that extradition would be futile and ruled against extradition proceedings. No evidence as to why it would be futile. It was just part of the process, the constant historic process of obstruction by Danish government and police officials. Vaernet's son, Kjeld, later twice inquired on his father's behalf whether the Danish government would refrain from pressing charges if he went back to Denmark. On both occasions, in 1959 and 1965, the Justice Minister obscured and obfuscated, declining to give any guarantees. Vaernet therefore stayed in Argentina until he died in November 1965. He lived there all those years, openly under his full original name with the complete and total knowledge of the Danish and Allied authorities. No effort, no attempt was ever made to put him on trial. Possibly because they thought his research to cure homosexuality was legitimate. After all, similar attempts were taking place here in Britain. Alan Turing was subjected to chemical castration with the approval and supervision of British doctors. Soon afterwards, British doctors on the National Health Service at public expense were forcing gay men to undergo electric shock and nausea-inducing drug therapies to supposedly cure their homosexuality. So you can see that in the context, the Allied response was not much different from the Nazi. The final good thing to come out of all of this is that when the files were finally opened on Vaernet, it further revealed that another more than 24 Danish citizens and war criminals escaped justice as well, protected by highest officials in the Danish government and police force and intelligence services in the post-war period. So Vaernet was not the only one. He was the only one doing these particular experiments, but other Danish citizens who should have been put on trial for war crimes were protected from prosecution. So we never got justice. Vaernet escaped justice, and so did I think about 30 others also escape justice as well. It's not a satisfactory outcome, but at least now we know the history. We know what was done and how that person, in this case Carl Vaernet, escaped justice. It is, I think, a lesson from history that we must always pursue justice. Whatever the reason, whatever the circumstances, those who commit war crimes and crimes against humanity should be pursued for the right of the victims to have their day in court. Thank you.